Welcome to Consciously Cannabis. I'm Carly, host of Consciously Clueless, the podcast bringing you this series. Together with guests, I'll be exploring cannabis through lenses of sustainability, mindfulness, and plant-based living. Bonus content from Consciously Cannabis will be available at patreon.com/consciouslycarly. Take a hit, or don't, all are welcome here, and let's get lit. So let's get into that. You are the Chief Impact Officer at On the Revel. Can you tell listeners what that means?
Yeah. So On the Revel is really the parent company of a collection of curated networking and educational events, really focused on what we call democratizing legal cannabis market information for the communities most impacted by the war on drugs. And I'm a lawyer by trade and an educator at heart. I started my career as a public school teacher, so I always had spirit. There's just always something to learn and then something to teach. I think it's a good way of showing love, not sharing knowledge. And we really recognize that one of the gaps that resulted from prohibition was the knowledge gap. People talk about, of course, the financial gap as we think about the capital it takes to start a business, any business, but particularly in the cannabis space. And that's super important, but also that knowledge gap. Just about the plant and its uses, the work of destigmatization. And then, of course, like for people who are interested in taking advantage of these opportunities that so many people fought for over the course of many decades in terms of legalization, just trying to help shorten the runway for those people so they can learn about these opportunities and figure out like how to find a space in that market if it's for them. We do a big business of cannabis conference. We also do a community education block party that's like our love letter to the New York community. And then we also do a business to business like trade show event. So our early operators who are folks who have cannabis convictions and criminal histories in New York, right, who are in communities that were decimated by the war on drugs, really giving them an opportunity as new operators to build their own kind of ecosystem with the values and characteristics that encourage them to build really successful, sustainable businesses.
Wow, that's really incredible and so hopeful when you know and learn the history of the war on drugs to hear the action that can take place to unravel that system is a breath of fresh air.
We consider ourselves to be in the belief business. Yeah, On the Revel is really like a portmanteau of On the Level, which is we're going to give you this information like straight up, no chaser. We want to be real about the opportunities, but also about like the challenges. Opening a barbershop. This is the Wild West, if you will, but also in an environment of revelry, right? That's put those two things together and it really speaks to our intention. So while we are direct and we tell the truth about the challenges, we also really believe that we got to encourage folks they're going to come and get a little bit of that spiritual nurturing when they come to Revel 2. You're going to find your people. You're going to be able to be more comfortable navigating this environment. And you're going to be able to let your hair down, so to speak, a little bit. You don't feel like you need to perform, that you can just come as you are and get what you need.
I so appreciate that because that concept is what started the podcast and the name Consciously Clueless, of just being like, wow, there's so much pressure in the vegan, eco-friendly mindfulness space online and all of that is you either do it perfectly or you suck. And
Yeah.
when I was diving into these things, I was like, well, that feels shitty. I want to have a podcast in a space where people can show up clueless and that's encouraged. And then they get to leave, hopefully, with a nugget of information at some point.
I love that. I love that. We're always in a posture of learning. People come to us and I think they see or they feel like expertise, and we have I want to build trust in making sure that we are like platforming people who really know what they're talking about and who have that experience. But we also want to demonstrate and model like we're constantly learning and we're not afraid to try something and make a mistake and learn from it. And I think as you mentioned, in like the vegan, eco, conscious world, similarly in the cannabis space, everything's so binary. It's you
Yeah.
know it, or you don't, you succeed or you don't. And things feel very much like a destination. But for us, like the work we do is a practice. And we're like constantly refining and bettering our practice and hopefully like modeling to other folks that like you can come in clueless and just start to put one foot in front of the other and really chart a path for yourself because you know you got a community of people around you who already see you at the end point and who are just like helping you step by step figure out what you don't know and figure out how to find out what you don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. You started as a public school teacher and you're a lawyer by trade
Right.
and you're the chief impact officer at On the Revel.
Yeah.
Where is the beginning of the interest in cannabis or maybe even cannabis policy or both come from?
I always say I come to this as a consumer first. And so that's where it started, smoking weed in college.
Same, same.
No kind of
I wasn't like, I'm drawn to the plant for healing. Like,
no. I
wasn't
grew up
that.
in, I grew up in the South, like in rural upstate South Carolina, and what I say is the land that was like 30 years behind where we actually were, late 80s, early 90s. And that stigma was crazy. And so I never even used in a, okay, this is not like reefer madness kind of way
Right.
until I was in college. But yeah, like I'm a human rights lawyer and I went to my first job out of law school was at the ACLU of New York. And it was around the time that we were really working on a lot of policing practice stuff like stop and frisk and just really terrible consequences of 30 years of over policing. And we were able to use data to tell a story about what those stops look like in the aggregate on the street, what impacts they had to folks' ability to retain like employment and educational funds. And we have a lot of public housing here. It was just all of this crazy impacts. And we started to realize that so much of it was just driven by the fact that cannabis was unlawful in New York, simple possession. So that connection was made for me being out doing that kind of community facing work around policing, but telling the story about cannabis. And it really opened the door for me to take that like equity, justice, like restoration framework and then pivot into in 2017 an actual government role, which I never expected I would. You like fight the man for 5 years and then it's, oh, I become the man, if you will, on purpose.
Pain from
But
the inside.
yeah, it was just important. I thought I was gonna go in and really stand back and observe and watch and learn and then take all that knowledge back to the outside. But I accepted that job in government the day election day 2016 before we knew the result. And I started 3 days after Donald Trump's inauguration. Suddenly, Council for Civil Rights became this really necessary role. I didn't get to stand in the back. I got pushed to the front really early. And I had all kinds of issues, immigration and criminal justice and housing. But the politics around cannabis legalization really changed in 2018. The door just swung wide open in New York when the stars aligned politically. And so much of this work is about positionality and where you are. And I just happened to be in a place where we could continue that advocacy work, but now we had someone, at least one of the advocates, like on the inside, being able to really drive the policymaking process or be a big part of that. I didn't anticipate having this much of a sort of finger on the pulse in terms of cannabis legalization, but I'm glad that I do.
Showing up into a space talking about cannabis and the war on drugs as a person of color is a unique experience than walking into those spaces as a white person being like, I want to fix the system that hasn't necessarily affected me. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, so many of the issues that I work on are inherent to me. Like my
Right.
day job, if you will, I do LGBTQ human rights work as a queer person. So I had some exercise that muscle a little bit, but I always try to show up as my whole self in any space. I think in the advocacy world, we do so much work in elevating the stories of the most directly impacted folks. But it was really when I went into government, the first time I'd worked around a majority white group of people because I was embedded in community in my previous role. Cannabis was still so stigmatized. I would walk around the state capitol and people would be like, "Oh, you got a joint? Are you high right now?" Like that kind of that lack of like seriousness about. So then when you're able to like come back with actually between the years of 2011 and 2019 over 800,000 black and brown New Yorkers, most of them under the age of 24, were stopped, frisked, and then had misdemeanor charges because they pulled out a joint in their pocket. And then talk about the collateral impacts again to like education and scholarships, to the ability for a 19-year-old kid to then be able to go home and live with their parents in public housing with this cannabis conviction that precludes them from being on the property. Then you start to see people say, this isn't a joke. This is actually serious public policy. We shouldn't have to put our identities on like that. Women and people who are able to become pregnant shouldn't have to have that be the thing that they lead with when they talk about bodily autonomy and reproductive justice, right? But oftentimes, because it's so personal, those stories and that navigation just happens like naturally because it's who we are and it's as we live.
I feel that kind of push and pull feeling sometimes of wanting to lead and with authenticity and use my POV honestly. And then sometimes I'm really pissed that I have to, and I don't know where to meet sometimes.
I have a client who is the parent of a 15-year-old trans girl, right? And they're going through some things. And part of what we talk about is like, who wants to wake up every day and fucking fight? I want to live. And yeah, I get that tension, right?
Yeah.
Where you know that fighting is necessary to live, but you don't want your life to be defined by just fighting. There's so much more to life than fighting for human rights that we have inherent to us.
What is the connection or relationship between queer culture and cannabis that people might not have heard about or thought about?
One thing that's really striking to me is the way in which cannabis community connected with queer community in a time of deep crisis, and that was during the early days of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. Like the government, particularly the Reagan administration, famous, he didn't even say the word AIDS for the first few years. No public health funding. We can forget now because we've made so much progress in terms of treatment. Many, particularly poor gay men, were dying, and the cannabis community really showed up. Brownie Mary's pretty famous advocate in San Francisco that was providing cannabis to AIDS patients who were suffering from wasting syndrome. The buyers clubs that developed around the country. Yeah, there's a real history there of shared struggle, shared burden of survival. But I think the cultural piece too. Queer people often are on the vanguard of culture, in part because queer people, we are often marginalized. Cannabis folks exist in the margin, and we create culture there that over time gets normalized and adopted into the mainstream. So there's so many wonderful connections of possibility and vision that I think have existed historically, and I'm so excited about for the New York market.
I love learning about those connections that you wouldn't think about. The queer community and the cannabis community at the height of the AIDS crisis, that is something that you wouldn't think about, people that are supporting each other, but it really just always is people on the fringe are finding ways to survive and team up, and it's within every industry, every I just watched a documentary about music and was like, "Oh, yeah, underground, like, hip hop and grunge both liked each other and supported each other because they were on these weird side clubs, and it was, like, people of color and grungy boys," and I was like, "This is so interesting, you don't think about it, but everyone who's trying to fight that mainstream ends up together."
Yep, yep, so much. And that was such a an illustration when I went into government, because so much of my practice there was to find the folks on the margin and pull them into those spaces. So we did the first meeting of legacy operators in a government setting. I remember being in government and I went to like illegal cannabis social club. Because again, we're like, we can't just talk to the polished, like in crowd, right? Like the lobbyists for the big companies, they come and they do the dance, but there's so much to be learned about the realities of what we're trying to do, like from the fringes. So I think people in places of formal power, I have a responsibility, at least I felt like I did, to figure out a way to build a bridge or a platform in order to bring what was in the margin into the mainstream, because now what we were doing is in the mainstream and we should do it in a way that doesn't continue to exclude the margins. Like, how terrible would it be for the cannabis community and the queer community and the folks who existed in the margins in the 80s and 90s and were doing mutual aid in this really necessary way when government wasn't showing up? Like, how much of a tragedy would it be if government then goes, oh, okay, now we're doing that, and then still forget those people? No, we have to center those people, because without them, we would have never even known that this was a possibility that we could mainstream. So we got to have a lot of respect for people who figure out how to make it and survive when the institutions of power forget about them.
And not only forget about them, but sometimes actually try and get rid of them.
Or actively harm them. Yeah, yeah,
Right,
totally.
right. Pushing them out not only of the margin, but like of the world.
Yeah, totally.
So I'm curious about your thoughts with the cannabis industry. It's growing in the US in terms of legalization or even just acceptance that it's a thing, and maybe reefer madness can be like put to bed a little bit. How do we move forward with that and make this industry sustainable in terms of the earth and the planet? It's so easy to see how it would fall into the, I don't know, late stage capitalist trap and just be an industry like all others. And how do you find that? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a place where I'm continuing to learn a
Mm.
lot more. I think one of the things that we are trying to do here in New York is start with thinking about sustainability from the architecture of the market itself. In New York, we have a two-tier market similar to the way that alcohol people probably understand alcohol, the alcohol market. And so what that means is, just by virtue of making sure that people who own and operate in the cultivation and processing tier don't also operate and own in the retail tier, it creates an environment that's conducive to smaller businesses. And we're hopeful that just that foundational piece will give us a good foundation, head start to building sustainability. I think regulation is important. We can see, especially from early legalization states, Colorado, Washington, California, now that their markets have matured, things like um, cultivation processes, packaging, delivery, you can quantify those impacts and then figure out ways to arrest those environmental impacts. And then I think the other pillar that I'm thinking about is the community engagement piece. There are people doing crazy creative stuff on a local and hyper local level. And when we talk about a new industry that is scaling, if we can find those people who are like doing those innovative things and platform them and help to expand them as the market grows, then I think there's so many ideas out there that we don't even know now that are possible. And it's possible because we're in a posture of expanding and growing like a new industry.
So it sounds like with this talk about sustainability, and I think I'm making an assumption, correct me if I'm wrong. And I think with the cannabis industry in general, what you're explaining is this idea of like individual action and like bigger action. And there's sometimes so much debate in these spaces, in the vegan space, in the environmental space, and all of it. No, you should be focusing on policy. No, you should be focusing on your everyday swaps. And I'm always genuinely so confused why we can't do both.
Both, right? Yeah. I
Would
mean,
you agree?
yeah, definitely. Consumer choice is going to be like huge here because we do have this thriving legacy market, and it will continue to be here in some form, right? It's not going to completely go away. And we have more tools in our toolkit, if you will, when it comes to the regulated market. So part of it is just going to be making that attractive to
Right.
consumers. And I think that's where you get into that individual choice.
Mhm.
What am I conscious of as a consumer? And then are those options accessible and available, like
Yeah.
to, and then the more macro, stuff, which I think, relates to business practices that are going to be guided so much by the environment of regulations that folks are going to be in. So what kind of grow lights are you using?
Right.
What are you doing in terms of construction footprint? Are you utilizing existing build outs or spaces where you need to do minimal work? I think all of those
Right.
things, are we creating incentives from a market-based perspective in order for actors and entrepreneurs to make those choices? So there's a lot of levers and dials to pull, and I don't think that we should let perfect be the enemy of good, or
Mhm.
perfect information be an impediment to us individually or collectively just starting to do something.
If there are people listening who are like, okay, I smoke weed, I buy into the cannabis industry, legally or not legally, we're not here to judge, but what would you say to them if they're like, okay, I want to make a difference?
Oh, that's a big question.
Give
And
me all of the answers possible, just so you know.
I one thing is just to be a more conscious consumer. One of the things is know your grower. One small step, right, that you can take as a consumer. I grew up in South Carolina. My grandfather is a farmer, so I grew up on a farm. If and so we live in New York City now, and you go to the supermarket or the farmer's market, and I come from an environment where we knew either we grew it ourselves or you. So I have this history of knowing where my food came from, if you will. And I think I think it's really exciting to introduce that aspect to the consumer piece of the legal market, because we do have these small farms that have these great stories, and they're local to New York. And so then you get to understand how is this produced, and so you are making those choices in your consumption. That's just like baseline. But I think if the industry really hits for you, or if you're like, there may be like something more there for me, I think there are obviously the licensed opportunities, but I'm super excited about the what we call the ancillary businesses, all of the things that exist that are necessary for the industry but aren't plant touching,
Oh,
right?
interesting.
Yeah, so you can think about it like the gold rush. There's a saying that the people who went out west for the gold rush, it wasn't the people who made the most money were the people who saw the picks and the shovels, right? Transportation and logistics, security, marketing and professional services. All of these things are going to be a part of the ecosystem, right? So there's a lot more than just like having a license to process or cultivate or process or retail. So there's a way to get in the game. And then the third big thing I'll say is just educating yourself,
Yeah.
right? There's a hunger across the city right now, and across the country too, as legalization happens, for people just to try to be like, what does this mean? And you can never do too much education. So there's always that each one reach one or each one reach 10 kind of thing. So take 5 minutes or 10 minutes, read a bullet point one pager from your trusted source, the Drug Policy Alliance or another organization, and just get a little bit more familiar. You don't have to be an expert, just get a little bit more familiar and then share that with somebody else. All those I think are just really excellent ways to take that next step, if you will, or
Yeah,
that first. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. There's a couple different levels of suggestions there for people.
Yeah, totally. Everybody's not going to want to be, everybody doesn't see themselves in this industry. When we were doing the legislation and thinking about this, we were singularly focused on, okay, how do we create equitable, restorative economic opportunity? And we take a step back and you're like, but everybody who's impacted by the war on drugs don't want to sell weed. Of course, we have the Community Reinvestment Fund, which once we start making money, 40% of those tax revenues will get reinvested in the community. So there's a whole other sort of sector. I come from the nonprofit space. I've worked for organizations that could potentially be the beneficiary of those funds. So there's a whole ecosystem there of community-based organizations and other folks who often struggle to find sustainability themselves because
Yeah.
they're doing work that isn't revenue generating and that a lot of people won't pay for. So this is also an opportunity to supercharge like that market and ecosystem and then create these great like relationships and stories from harm to restoration and then like
Yes.
back on that virtuous cycle.
I think people really connect to that. There's, again, we could talk about the why people need these tragedies to connect to things, but also there's this human nature of being like, oh, that's just not my perspective. And I had no freaking clue that from that point of view, that's how the world operated. Some of those kind of like world eye-opening stories can really be what changes someone's mind on a various amount of things.
I love this industry and the work around it in large part because it is an incredible, like once in a generational opportunity for us also to like pilot creative public policy responses that are restorative. We don't do a lot of restorative justice in public policy. And we're constantly searching for ways in which we could use public policy to correct some of the harms of previous public policy. And this industry is like a wealth of opportunity to try to be creative and visionary about what that could look like. And we haven't had that opportunity. Like we're facing right now a real housing crisis in New York City, right? Like people who make the city run can't afford to live here. And
Right.
if they can't over time, New York City is just going to become Disney World, right? And we don't want that to happen. And but we have all of this like empty commercial space because nobody's going back. Manhattan's 60% empty. So we have an environmental problem, right? Because we have this wasted space that's generating carbon emissions and it's not being utilized. We have a housing crisis. So how do we vision like new solutions that are restorative? Because part of the reason we have a housing crisis is because of public policy that has excluded poor people and people who are marginalized from being able to have access to like safe, decent, affordable housing. And so I'm thinking like, what can we now take from this cannabis fight that we've had in
Yeah.
terms of that public policy and then experiment in the housing space or experiment in other aspects of criminal justice. So if I'm a little geeked out on the just the possibilities that exist, I don't even think we've scratched the surface yet. And I love, especially in a moment right now where I think just our collective consciousness is struggling right now to see a brighter vision, right? I think we're being drugged down by so many things.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful and makes me wonder because all of the things you're doing seems like you're giving so much of your energy to things, your day job, this, to what you're passionate about and what you care about, and to make the world the place you want to be. How are you taking care of yourself? And what practices do you have to like mindfully not burn out? Asking for a
Burnout,
friend.
burnout is my nightly or almost nightly calls with my 3-year-old nephew. But family, they know who I am and they know when the intervention is necessary.
Yeah.
And they're just and it's family and chosen family. So just being very aware of as much as I want to be like a good lawyer and a good community advocate and a good community educator, I also want to be a really good son and brother and uncle and friend. When I try to put as much into that because it also reminds me that that's as important as all of the sort of external stuff. I am a creative, and so I love to cook. I love to sing and perform and storytell. And my business partners, at Revel, they'll send me out with our merch and they're like, Jason's on the loose, send him out with a camera. And he's just out in the community doing his thing.
Yes, I love that.
So those are like some of mine, but also super introspective stuff too. Reading, writing, like listening to music. I just try to like balance is what I'm really looking for. So there's no one thing for me other than just always thinking about, is your energy balance, is your psyche balance, is the time balance, are you in a state of equanimity, and if you're not, are you able to identify what's rustling the lily pads and what you need to take care of.
That's such a big piece, right? Not only, okay, having this awareness, but then figuring out what to do with the information, which are not things we're readily taught often. In hearing those cues from our body, we're so disconnected from our physical selves. Is cannabis ever a part of mindfulness practices for you, or is that something different?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I usually consume, meditate like first. That's like my sort of start to the morning. My friends are like, you wake up at ridiculously early. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not doing anything. Like I'm doing me. Cause
Yeah, yeah,
like
100%.
and it jives with the city. Because again, I'm a country boy who's lived in New York City for New York City is my home, but like I'm a country boy at heart. And so the city's super quiet in the morning. Like it's just waking up. It's like my favorite time in New York City, like 5:30 in the morning. So I align with the rhythms of the city that way. But also cannabis is very social for
Mhm.
me. Enjoying a good conversation with my people after a long day while we're sharing a joint is probably my sort of favorite thing to do.
There are not as many things that feel like true medicine than being in community and sharing the gift of weed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Truly.
I 100% agree. And I get to be a part of a company that at its core is does just that. Yeah, we've been able to build an entire business and just off that kind of basic um reality. And I'm so grateful for that.
It feels like such an underappreciated at times tool for action and for change is community. People on the fringes have known it forever because that's how you survive. And breaking up community is the idea of the oppressor, right? Because that's
100%.
power. Community is power.
We talk a lot, especially in this moment, with folks and really encourage them. Like, you have to be, in order to compete, you must collaborate first. Because we're in a position right now where the moneyed interest and the multi-state operators that are well capitalized, the people who are used to throwing around their financial power, their political power, they have very different ideas about how the industry should develop and evolve and what their place should be in it vis-a-vis other people. And we won't be able to resist their we're playing asymmetrical chess, if you will. So we have to recognize the power in community, our collective power, and then we have to move in ways that are collaborative, so we get to an environment and a space where we are all competing and existing. And I always say, this is New York City. There's more than enough for everybody to eat and get full.
Yeah.
um, we have to keep preaching that gospel, especially now, because everything can seem so um, scarce. And I don't believe opportunity and resources are scarce. I just believe that they are misallocated.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for those words. I appreciate that. Is there anything that you want to share with listeners that I haven't given you space to do so or hasn't come up?
For those folks who are in New York or will be in New York, just a broad invitation to On the Revel. We think of ourselves as like the cannabis clearinghouse. We don't have all of the answers, really all of the questions, but I think that it is really intimidating and daunting for a lot of people to take the first step. They see this, they want to know more for whatever reason, whatever point of attachment or engagement. It just seems like a minefield maze. And so part of what we want people to do is know you can come here as a first stop, and we can help you figure out where it may be that you want to go. So we have packed calendar for 2024, and all of our content is available on our YouTube channel and on Instagram. So we're really trying to reach you in as many ways as possible, and just would love to welcome as many folks who are looking for cannabis home into the fold.
I love that. We can put all of that in the show notes so people can easily find that and connect with you. I know they're going to want to. Thanks for listening to an episode of Consciously Cannabis. If you're not ready for this episode to be over, don't worry. Every Consciously Cannabis episode has bonus content. Sometimes guests and I will smoke together. Maybe you'll see some of my friends and I toke up. Who knows? Go to patreon.com/consciouslycarly and get all the bonus content. And thank you so much for listening to this new series. If you enjoyed it, remember to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Share it with a friend. Tell someone you know. Anything helps, and I so appreciate it. See you next time.